I'm excited to join you here today with my friend Ian Urbina from the Outlaw Ocean Project. And Ian has a very interesting career and very interesting initiative with the Outlaw Ocean Project. So much has been accomplished through it. I thought, what a great way for our audience to get some exposure to it, and frankly, for it to be the last podcast of the year, which is finishing the year with a bang. He is also the first professional journalist that I'm interviewing on the podcast. So I was joking with Ian just before that said I'm more nervous than he is this time around because he does this all the time and has won a Pulitzer in the process. So we'll chat a bit more about that. But Ian, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Ian, let's start a little bit about your history, sort of as an individual growing up in the U.S. and even a little bit about your family heritage. And I know you had if I recall correctly, it was a grandfather that was a first judge. So just a little bit about that because I think it helps to put into a perspective of how you got here today. So tell us a bit about it, Ian.
Yeah, no, so I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and that's where I live now. And I was a cultural anthropologist before I was a journalist, and I worked on Cuba um, and lived a bunch of places. Um, I married my language teacher from high school. So there's a linguistic thread that runs in the family. My son is a polyglot, and I hope to get him under your tutelage one day, Gary. But he hopes to be an interpreter, translator when he grows up. He's in college now. Like you said, my father. I'm, of mixed descent. So my father is Black Puerto Rican, and my mother is Irish. They both were born in the U.S. My father was a federal judge here in Washington, D.C. for many years and handled a bunch of thorny, high-profile cases before he retired about 10 years ago. And yeah, I began working as an investigative journalist about 3 decades ago. I left grad school and went straight to the New York Times and stayed there for many years. And then about 3 years ago, I decided to create my own journalism shop so that I could specialize on this particular topic.
So Ian, I've had a lot of people, especially when we announced the partnership with the Outlaw Ocean Project, ask a little bit about what drives the work and what does the day to day look like. So, if you were to take us through a day in your regular day, what does that look like? What does the day in Ian's uh,
Uh,
schedule when on the field, especially? So,
yeah, that's what I was going to say. That distinction is important. So when I'm on land, which is about 2/3 of the year, then I'm in this little office in my backyard, and I have a staff of 12. They're all different places around the world, and we're working hard on either the next reporting trip or the current investigation and its story. When I'm in the field, typically, one of the things that we do that is unique is we report all the stories at sea or in theater. So if we're looking at a story about the abuse of migrants crossing the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe, launching from Libya, then we won't do that story unless we can actually go to Libya and also go on the water. And that's actually the last investigation we did. I took a team into Libya, and I had another team on the water. And again, Alexa Translations was hugely helpful in that investigation and handling all the different languages that we were encountering. Most of the reporting is at sea, and I do all the at sea reporting. And that means going to fishing grounds, usually high seas fishing grounds, which are hundreds, if not thousands of miles from shore. And that means you're looking at, 10 days, 2 weeks just to get to the fishing grounds. And then when you're there, um, it's a complicated process to try to get these folks to talk to you because they're very skeptical. You're a journalist and an odd presence there. And so it's a sort of stepwise process so that you can approach these boats and slowly, safely try to warm them up to the notion of at least engaging with you radio to radio, bridge to bridge. And then maybe if you get lucky, you'll get on board and actually be able to directly inspect the conditions and talk with the crew. The investigation we just finished took 4 years. It was focused on the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, and we were the first Western journalists to ever get on Chinese distant water fishing vessels and spend some time in a bunch of places around the world. But that's why it took 4 years, and it's super expensive and slow and sometimes dangerous. Not so much that the people will do you harm. Typically, you're not getting on a vessel unless you're invited or you're with law enforcement. And so if you're invited, the captain is not just boss, but God on these vessels. And if he says, yeah, you can come on board, then no one's going to mess with you. The danger in this setting is the conditions. You're dealing with places where swells or waves are, 2 stories tall at all times. And, the floor is extremely slippery and sort of shifting in a fun house kind of style, and they're massive gear and equipment, and you're working 20 hours, and often the heaviest fishing happens in the middle of the night, and so it's dark, and there's a lot that can go wrong. At the ship to ship transfer, for you to get onto a ship, you're looking at climbing a rope ladder that might be 2-3 stories tall, as because there aren't bridges that go ship to ship. You have to climb up onto it. So these are the things that make it truly dodgy.
And Ian, I have lots more questions about that, but I'll go back to a couple of things really around a little bit about your upbringing and who had. I mean, this is some exciting work, but you to become the Ian that you became today, who had the biggest impact growing up on you and on your life?
That's a good question. I've never gotten that question, so I don't have an answer sitting on the tip of my tongue. I think it's hard to cite one person. If I think that my wife, she was my high school Spanish teacher. I pursued her for a bunch of years, and finally, I was enamored with her intellectually and in many other ways. And now she's my wife, going on 23 years or longer. And I think, truth be told, she would be the one that had the most impact on me, aside from, say, my parents. My dad was a judge. He was a sort of by the book, kind of a typical stereotypic judge. My mom was the opposite. They split when I was very young. She, there was no rule that she wasn't willing to break. She was a real maverick, and the combination of the two of them, they both had a real deep sense of justice, and both came from very poor backgrounds, and so all of that informed my desire to do work that felt like it had some positive impact on the world. So I think the combination of those three figures informed the journalism.
And unsurprising, I must say, and I think it's also important to understand the background when it plays out in the current work. The story about your wife is fascinating, and she probably makes you keep up with the Spanish even to this day. So.
Yeah, I'll never. Yeah, yeah. She graded me fairly poorly and still does in Spanish.
But also our spouses or partners tend to be the most critical, our biggest critics, as much as they are our biggest fans. So
Quite right.
comes with the
Quite right.
territory.
Yeah, yeah.
Ian, certainly your work is demanding, but before I go into some of the questions, to understand the work a little bit more, what do you do for fun? What are the hobbies that Ian enjoys outside of this Indiana Jones lifestyle?
um, I I was a runner. My dad was an amazing runner. He went to the Olympic trials in '68. He won the national championship in college. He was an incredible runner. And I sort of, starting at age 10, uh, not by choice, followed in the sort of family footsteps and went into the family business of track and cross country. And that kind of shaped my life norms, in that I became fairly addicted to some sort of endorphin, poor man's mental health meds every day, and that comes in the form of exercise. I've stopped running. I now do CrossFit, but the answer to your question is I do rely on exercise a fair amount for sanity and pleasure. So that's one thing, and then I listen to a lot of music. I sooner would turn on music than I would turn on the TV, probably, and that is the other thing that I use to relax.
And Ian, if I want to take a page out of that book and use the exercise as my two birds in one. You know, it's your hobby and you get your exercise at the same time. So
That's right. That's right. Yeah, but don't try to stop it. That's the at sea. I'm about to head back to sea for a month in Antarctica, and you're on a ship in Antarctica. There's not a whole lot that you can do to really get that endorphin fix. And so I'm praying to have a rowing machine or something because it is an addiction, you know. And if you go cold turkey, you feel it. So that is the downside of being so dependent on anything.
now this may not be the best advice, but somebody that just did a tour in Antarctica told me they did the polar bear dip. And that nothing gives your body and muscles an exercise like trying to swim when in those cold waters. So that may be one way to challenge yourself.
It'll be the last you hear of me too. But yes, duly noted on the suggestion.
And you notice with a caveat at the beginning, it's like this may not be the best suggestion, but they tried this and they survived.
You warned me.
The lady that did do it is also a marathon runner and pretty fit. So because as she was telling me that, I was like, I don't know that I would survive that.
No, I don't think that's for me. I'm a land creature, so I don't trust myself in that kind of cold water and as dangerous as the waves are up there. No, down there.
No, fair enough. So Ian, just you're the like I mentioned at the beginning, you're the first journalist I actually interview in this context, and excited that it is you. Now, there may be people listening, being like, I always wondered what it would be like to go through a career journey of this nature, or to really understand a little bit about how your career evolved. Would you mind taking us through a bit of the more formative career, more pivotal moments, and sort of what it looked like?
I mean, for me, I followed a very zigzaggy, non-traditional path. I mean, even getting hired at the New York Times was odd, because I had not in high school. The normal trajectory is you like writing, you like news, you like journalism, you get involved in your high school with the, yearbook or the student newspaper. You do that at college. You start interning during summers, your late college phase. Maybe you even go to journalism school for a master's degree, and then you start in local papers and build your way up. That's the traditional textbook. And most people, in my case, I went to grad school for cultural anthropology. I was very convinced that I wanted sort of a life of the mind. I was not very good at languages. I did want to travel a lot. And I wanted to write stuff that a lot of people read and maybe helped fix things. So I then started freelancing on magazine type stories. I worked on the Middle East. I worked in West Bank for a while, and right after Janine was bombed, and spent some time doing 2 years doing work on that issue and that place, and that kind of whetted my appetite for conflict zone and sort of hopefully public service journalism. And then after 2 years of freelance magazine writing, I decided to just apply for traditional jobs, and the New York Times took me in partially because in retrospect, I realized they had the ability to take a chance on someone like me, and they could teach me how to write fast and clean. I brought other things, like academic background, etc., and spent time a bunch of places in the world, so that interested them. Um, so that's my trajectory is very atypical. When I got to the Times, I always wanted to do what I'm doing now. I want to do long form, investigative, international. Okay, but you're not going to get onto that specialty without paying a lot of dues and learning what you're doing and building up a lot of trust with your institution. So it took me a good 15 years of beat reporting, Senator so-and-so embezzled this money, a school shooting over here, the standard stories that fill the newspaper that are breaking news, which was not my fare. I didn't really enjoy it as much as I think it's important, but I had to do that for about 15 years, running all over the country, et cetera, mostly national. And then I started inching my way into international stuff. And then I inched it into a specialty. So that's the path I followed.
And Ian, the to take then the sort of the step to go and do something on your own, it's certainly the learnings from the New York Times would have been helpful, and also from you getting comfortable. But what drove you to start the Outlaw Ocean Project?
So the final 2 years, I was in 2014. I sat down with my editor and she said, "What do you want to do next?" And I said, "I think it would be amazing to do a series about the watery two-thirds of the planet and do it a little bit differently than traditional ocean reporting is done. Not rewrite of academic papers about marine stories, but rather a human approach to the this frontier that has 50 million people, 50 million people working out there, but from whom we never hear or about whom we never hear. So send me out there. Let me go try to get on these vessels. Let me try to sort of bring back amazing, kind of narrative." She said, "Okay." I went 2 years of reporting, produced it for the newspaper, a whole series ran. Then I left for another 2 years and went on a book leave. Went back out to sea, took this amazing videographer from Brazil with me, produced the book. Then I went back to the paper and thought, there are so many incredible stories and so few, if any, journalists out there doing this, that this feels like something I should double down on. And if I could just find a way to make the economics work. And so I started thinking, okay, well, what would I do differently if I could do whatever I wanted? And I'd say, okay, well, I don't want to run, I want to not only cover the space differently, and consistently, but I also want to cover the space at the intersection of human rights and labor concerns on the one hand and environmental concerns on the other. So don't just get into the silo of one type of story or the other. And then number two, stop pulling stories out of the developing world and feeding them to the developed world. It feels sort of extractive, and instead produce stories, but make sure that they run all over the world, including in the context that you're pulling them out of, those folks that are most impacted. So that was a different model. And then do some funky things, meld journalism with art and murals to try to get young people and non-reading news consumers interested. So I had all these wild ideas that I wasn't going to be able to do at the Times. When I went back to the Times, they said, "Look, we need you to move on to a new topic. That's been great, but now you're back and we need you to look at this or that." And I kind of wanted to stick with this one line of reporting. So I left and I began fundraising with large philanthropies that understand journalism and understand what lines they can't cross. Like they can't tell you what to do and they can't tell you what stories to cover and they can't even see the story before it runs, but they believe in the value of what you're doing. So I fundraised and created what we have now.
Uh, and in there were so many nuggets of information there that were particularly interesting. So running it at both the developing and developed world at the same time, because sometimes we don't fully, especially in the Western world or the developed world just general, we don't fully appreciate how skewed the amount of information we have, and speed of information and the type of information we have versus the developing world, and touching on what happens when people don't have the ability to read, which is still a big chunk of the world's population, and how do you cater to them. So those are really interesting takeaways that frankly I'm also learning
Mm.
for the first time on some of these items, which is extremely interesting. Now, certainly anytime you go into this type of work, it is going to have its own set of challenges. What are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered?
Well, one of them is funding. Just to be blunt, we just finished this investigation. Took 4 years. We went to the high seas near the Falkland Islands, the high seas near the Galapagos Islands. These are all separate reporting trips that take months. The sea border with North Korea and the coast of West Africa, getting on fishing vessels, et cetera, et cetera. It's brutally time intensive, and to get out there and to do all the translation again with help from Alexa and others, but the drones and the petrol and everything you need to pull this off is crushing. And so I spend a third of my time fundraising, and that's not my dream, scenario. So that's one hard thing. But truth be told, within the journalism itself, I'd say the hardest thing tends to be the logistics. If we set a requirement on ourselves, as we do, which is we're only going to take a story if we can actually make it narrative. So it's a story, not an article. It's not just stacking of facts. It's like a beginning, middle, and end. It's got a character. And even if you don't care about issue X or topic Y, you like a good yarn, and so that's a story. And so if we're going to do narrative journalism and we're going to do it reported in theater, how can we do that? And the logistics of how are you going to get into Libya and not get killed? How are you going to get out 1,000 miles from shore to get on these vessels? Like the logistics of setting up those goals are intense. And then when you're at sea, you're on an in-bed for a month and a half on a South Korean squid vessel. It's a pretty dirty, rough environment. You got to make sure you don't get sick. They're not bringing you back to shore. You can't get infections. You got to bring people with you that you really trust, who know how to size folks up. It's any conflict zone reporting. It's that. So those logistics are intricate and difficult. But in some ways, the part I love the most, especially when I'm in theater. I don't like setting up the trips, but I do really quite like the challenge of when we're on them.
And I can appreciate the challenges can also give that adrenaline shot of like, okay, I'm now dealing with the logistics I pre-planned.
Right.
Uh, Ian, you touched on something that I would like our audience to have an opportunity to at least be aware of how to help or how to contribute. Fundraising being one of the biggest challenges. Certainly, you do very impactful stories and very impact. Some of these are very important causes that you're sort of touching on certain aspects of them, but they are so much more. They can be so much bigger at times, and the more funding is available, the more you can do with it. How can listeners help? What are the opportunities for you to for them to help, and how do they reach out?
Yeah, I mean, theoutlawocean.com is the website. And when you go to the website, there's a subscribe and there's a donate. The subscribe is a direct way that we deliver the goods to people who want to keep track of it. And it's an email newsletter. And you can subscribe for free and you'll get the same stuff as those who don't. So I'll just be very honest about it. And that's on principle. But a lot of folks opt to put something in the till, $5 a month, $10 a month. And that makes a huge difference. I'd say 20% of our operating budget comes from average folks like that. And then the other option is donate. There's a button there and you can fill it out. And so those are the two ways on the website, or just email me, Ian at theoutlawocean.com. And I can walk you through whatever, make it easy on you. If some folks say, look, I don't want to do it digitally, I want to mail you a check. Okay, shoot me an email and I'll send you the information. And then it's all tax deductible and I'll give you all the information you need so that you get the tax benefit.
Yeah, and then for any listeners from enterprises that think they may be able to help in some in-kind way or in some way that, I've had conversations with Ian where it's anything from flight vouchers to being able to donate drones to things that can be used without that, especially if you're in those industries where you have that level of capability. I think all of those things can be helpful, and if it's easier for your enterprise to help in that way, it's all of these can equate to bigger and better projects.
Yeah, I would amplify that. I mean, we have folks who say, I run a huge hotel chain globally, and we would give you a room. We travel incessantly. And so, or like you said, frequent flyer miles. People donate them because often they never use them, but they accrue lots of them. Or they just, so they're, yeah, if people want to drop me an email, there's an email on the website, and they can get in touch and I can figure out if there's a way they can support. But thanks for asking.
No, I think it's important, Ian, as we do this, that not only to keep our audience informed and hear that you're a great story, but also to figure out ways to help. Now, Ian, your team is also experiencing consistently some challenging situations. Often it could be potentially dangerous. It can be long days, as you described, in conditions that could be cold and wet and with motion sickness potentially induced, regardless of how much medication you can take. So, how do you what are some of the ways you've kept the team motivated and kept the team sort of pushing through some of these difficult situations, including yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so on the vessels, if we're doing at sea reporting, we often get very few berths, meaning spots. So far, I've never gotten more than one berth other than myself. So it's a two-man team usually. I think I got one reporting trip where I had a plus two, and I brought two videographers who double as translators. Um, so the teams are really small. When I went on land in Libya, the team was a little bit bigger because we had a documentary crew with us. The safeguards we take are variable. So we have support from Garmin, for example, who equips us for free because they're sponsors of ours with small devices that we have on our belt at all time. If you go overboard, you want that device on your belt because it's got an SOS button and it'll track you. But we have, a whole protocol also in, especially, most of the really dangerous situations we've been in have been on land. So Somalia, Borneo, Mexico, and Libya. Always when things got really, really rough, it was on land. And we have a protocol where the most of the team, so 10 of the 12 on the team, are on land. And when we're in theater, someone is on duty 24/7, and they're receiving updates from us every 6 hours, just telling them where we are and that we're okay. In Libya, we were taken captive by a militia, and it was pretty awful. And but the plan that we had in place, luckily, um, worked pretty well. My wife was on the phone with me when I was taken, so she heard that, and that was probably life saving because she immediately activated, outreach to U.S. State Department, the White House, and that's who ultimately rescued us. So we have like those sorts of catch mechanisms. If we go dark for longer than X hours, then they know who they're supposed to call and what they're supposed to do. But honestly, for all that stuff you might do, the most consequential decision is the decision to go to these places. And once you get there, there's only, when I was taken by the militia, the first thing the guys came in when they came in the room, 12 armed guys, gun to the head, was, where's your tracking device? So they knew I had a Garmin because the room was bugged. And the first thing they knew to get out of the room and separate me from. So you can do lots of security measures, but in places where they want to do you harm, they're probably going to be two steps ahead of you. And you just have to, kind of hope for your best, and kind of obey your instincts also when it comes to sizing up folks. And when you have a spidey sense that, like, look, we should probably get out of this town faster than I was originally planning because I'm just getting some strange vibes, you should probably listen to those whispers.
And it's always a fine balance, right, Ian? Because you have so much to cover and so much information to extract and learn, and at the same time, you can't do that at the peril of you and your team. So that's incredibly fascinating.
Well, it's also a testament to what you have that I don't have, which is polyglot capabilities. Like, when you are truly fluent in many languages, especially the ones in the place where you're going, you have an ability to read signs much better than I do. I'm relying on translators, and that's a really thick, that's a bad lens. So I don't even know how to interpret a lot what's going down because I can't tell what the tone of what that guy was saying and things like that. So I'm even more at risk, and it's why I really respect those like you who can speak many languages.
Well, and Ian, very soon we'll be able to equip you with a little piece of equipment that you can hear live these things without relying on an interpreter.
Hmm.
But even then, the cues, picking up the cues, the cultural cues, and this is where there's only so much AI can do, right? The
Right, right.
cultural cues, how does this individual strike you? Where it's a balance between understanding all of their makeup as an individual, from uh, upbringing to nationality, ethnicity,
Right.
religion, and how that affects who they are today.
Yeah.
So this is what makes it. This is what makes it such a complex issue beyond just language.
Yeah.
And I've seen a few of these scenarios over time, and it is it makes your work incredibly challenging and at the same time rewarding.
I think
Uh,
so. Yeah. No, I agree.
so Ian, I have a just because this part of it I find I had so many questions and I have to be selective for the purpose of today just to make sure that as interesting to the audience as it is to me as well. So you have so many initiatives. There's so much that you can cover around the ocean. So many issues. How do you triage and how do you then decide? Here's what we're going to pursue next.
Which
What are
topic?
the biggest factors?
Yeah. So we engage. So take three steps back before you take two steps forward. So what can we do that's different than the New York Times or the New Yorker or the BBC or the Guardian or wherever? Okay. One is we can bring a decade's worth of tactical and subject matter fluency, so we know the right questions, how to ask them, where to go, etc. The second is we can, again, if we have the funding, then we can engage in slow journalism at a time when everything is speeding up to a perilous degree. And because as you speed up explanations and journalism, it gets thinner and often wrong. And That's what's happening in the news sphere, in the informational spheres. Everything's getting faster, smaller, shorter, and off. And so we're like, look, let's decidedly engage in slow journalism. So if something takes 4 years, then we're going to take 4 years. If it takes 3 months to just deal with one paragraph and one set of facts, let's deal with it. Or we take a whole nother trip. So that's the other thing we do. So okay, and then the other thing we try to do, kind of methodologically, is stay at the intersection of the human and the marine. So stay at that intersection. Don't drift into one or the other. Okay. So if you're choosing stories and those are your goals methodologically, then that frames it. What are stories that are going to still be fresh in a year from now, 2 years when we might finish? What are stories that we can have a seriously global impact? And I didn't mention this before. One of the things we do differently is we don't abide by exclusivity and copyright. So we self-fund, we then by philanthropy, etc. Then we come out 2 years later with this amazing story, and it's got lots of parts: a 10-part newspaper series, a 2-part magazine series, a documentary film, and a bunch of a podcast, a whole bunch of things, right? Then we go out and we say, hey, look, BBC, El País, El Globo, Le Monde Diplomatique, The Economist, the New York Times, the New Yorker. We have something for you. None of your folks can match it because we spent 3 years doing it. No one else goes out there. It's super polished. It's all legal. It's fact checked. Everything you want, it's here. You can have it. You can run it, and it will be free. Now that's a great word in the age of bad business journalism where no one's making money. But you cannot lock it down and only your readers get to have it. Maybe you get a week of exclusivity, but then it goes out to Gambia and Taiwan and Venezuela and all these other places, Libya, because those places are going to run it too. And you need to be okay with that. And we get help from Alexa and others to translate these things into foreign languages, and boom. Well, that means a story, the Pulitzer Prize winning project I worked on at the Times, 4 or 5 million max readers, right? The investigation we just put out ran in 36 countries in 12 languages and 115 venues. Over 250 million people consumed it. That's a huge impact. That's how you actually move the needle on really big issues, because it's getting read everywhere. And so how can we choose stories that can be told in a global fashion, that will still be fresh in 2 years from now, and can be reported in a narrative way on site? Though that's how we choose our stories.
And that's so important, Ian, because you mentioned this earlier. Especially in the countries where they're the most affected by some of these, and often they tend to be in the developing world. So, if they didn't have access to this information, then you're just really getting a demographic that is more curious, but not
Right.
affected by it all that much,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
or indirectly at least. I mean, overfishing affects all of us, for example, but it
Yeah.
is who impacts the most sometimes can be very far from here geographically.
And oftentimes those very places are complicit, right? There aren't pure culprits and pure victims. Everyone's a little bit of both, right? So oftentimes the developing contexts that are most impacted are also playing into it. But the very folks in those settings that are corrupt and doing bad things, the locals can't say that, or else they're going to get locked up. We can. So if we can find editors willing to run it, then we can now have an impact in those places in a way that really matters.
And Ian, again, I'm learning a lot from this podcast as I expected I would, but the slow journalism, another term that I feel like I should have been more familiar with, and it makes a lot of sense, especially in today's age where we're used to getting snippets of information through little articles that are, or almost massaged articles that are put into 3, 4 paragraphs, and you're like, okay, I just got some highlights, but there's so much depth I'm missing out of this.
Yeah, it's junk food. I mean, it tastes good going down, and we all
Yeah.
consume it, myself included, but it's not a great nutritional way to inform your brain.
Well, and this is, I mean, even just identifying that's a lot of what we're consuming. Just saying I'm up to speed on what's happening out there because I get a bunch of snippets is me eating a bunch of junk food and saying I've eaten today, and that's
Right,
not
right,
good enough
right, right.
for anyone that is in nutrition. We're using a lot of synonyms, but or a lot of parallels to draw from. Uh, Ian, two more things just from this last part, and one of these just more as an appeal to our audience. Anyone that had been sort of in the foreign service or they've been a former diplomat. That's another way that you can help Ian and the Ocean Project. Because they're involved in a lot of countries, often your influence and the ways you can help navigate some of the political stuff can be very helpful. So even though it may not be monetary, some of that can be very helpful. Ian and I have had a few of those conversations in the
Mhm.
past. I know many of our listeners have had that type of background in the past. That could be a great way to help. And
For sure.
the very example you gave, Ian, that being kidnapped by a militia while you're speaking to your wife, that could have been particularly dangerous if it wasn't for the right help following through.
Quite right.
So I want to ask you a little bit about because again, the audience, the Pulitzer Prizes tend to be very, very rare and by definition sought after, and our audience often won't get a chance to speak to a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. So what was the What was the work that led to that prize, Ian? Just for the and Ian has a Wikipedia page as well with a little bit more information on this for the purpose of our audience. But since we have him live, I thought, what better way to ask?
So to clarify, there are those reporters who win Pulitzers independently, is really impressive and not what I did. And there are those who win them when they're on a team. And I was on a team, and not even the lead player on the team. I was on a team of about 4 or 5 reporters at the New York Times who discovered that the then governor, Eliot Spitzer, governor of New York, was making use of prostitutes. And we got together and investigated it. Obviously, the concerns, apart from prostitution being illegal, is the potential for leveraging a very powerful former attorney general turned governor. So the New York Times broke that story and won the Pulitzer for that.
And that's also very. We appreciate the background, Ian. Certainly, the interest of even understanding that how that works, and to your point, winning it independently. It's so we're waiting for the Outlaw Ocean Project to get that again with some independence.
We are waiting for it too. Not holding our breath, but that would be quite nice. That would help us a lot. But we try not to think about those things because it's a lot of heartbreak.
And Ian, I know you described a little bit earlier around if anyone wanted to go into investigative journalism, sort of what the traditional path was and how yours was a little different. Would you have any advice for anyone that is considering that? Like, what are the things they should consider? And you outlined a path, but maybe tidbits that you could recommend.
Well, so I think there's a prerequisite question, which is anyone interested in going into journalism generally, and then the sort of narrow niche, smaller niche that is investigative. First, let's understand the terms. So, beat reporting is you're covering a region or a sport or a topic. You're the reporter on guns. You're the reporter on prisons. You're the reporter on France. So you're the White House reporter. These are beats, and your job is to. I was the Mid Atlantic beat reporter. That meant for the New York Times, it was the Mid Atlantic bureau chief. So anything that happened from the state of Kentucky all the way to the state of Ohio was my jurisdiction. And if I didn't get on a plane to go cover it, then I needed to assign someone to do it. And so that's beat reporting. And it means you're constantly sprinting and you're watching a terrain, a topic, and deciding, is this rising to the worthiness of us covering it? And if so, do we have something new to say, or what's the angle that's missed? Or is this feeling not really something we should be weighing in on just yet? The alternative is um, often called enterprise reporting or investigative. Enterprise is just enterprising, meaning you're coming up with ideas that are fresh, and it's sort of sui generis, notions of interesting thoughts or things happening in society. Investigative, as I define it, is more prosecutorial, and it's you're looking for things that are broken that bright light might help shed light on a fix. So you're already going into with a methodological bias. Like there are things that are broken in the world, and you want to shed light on them and reveal them, but hopefully in a responsible, rigorous, explanatory way that gets them fixed. That's what I wanted to do and what we do now. Most folks who end up in investigative do not start in investigative. It takes a lot of time because the stakes are really high. You can really get blowback. So it takes a while. But if you start with being a beat reporter, win the trust of your editors, do a good job, know how to write well, have a really fresh eye on things that feel like they're hiding in plain sight, but might make a really good story. And why hasn't anyone looked at this before? And be willing to carve out time in your busy schedule to chase those passion projects, even alongside your beat, and do that over many years. And that's how you end up coming into investigative.
Well, and not dissimilar to how you ended up starting the Outlaw Ocean Project. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Ian, we're about to go into the rapid fire questions, which is a part of our session where I ask you a few questions and you just give me one word answers.
Okay.
But before we get to that, I had one last question for you. With everything you know and have come to learn during this process, what is your advice on how we can act, both as a society and as individuals, towards to a more sustainable and just future for the oceans in a way that is equitable as well?
I mean, I think that there needs to be more journalism, and more importantly, there needs to be more governance, quite especially the high seas, this international waters space. How we all act, get behind it. So, as a taxpayer, ask questions to your lawmaker or the guy or woman you might elect. As a parent or sibling, read up, talk to people, ask, say, "Oh, I read this thing," and spread the word. Essentially, as a donor, which we all are, support something, not us necessarily, but other folks doing good work. As a buyer, spend a half hour, read up on, should I continue buying X and consuming it, or consider something else? These are all different hats we wear and different ways that we can all sort of have an impact.
No, and that's really important, Ian. Just not take things for granted and not assume that due diligence has been done on everything that we are able to buy, and that some of it is the responsibility lies with us to ensure some justice here. All right, so I'm to switch into something a bit more lighthearted, because that is extremely important, but at the same time, something that gives us a lot to think about. So to the rapid fire questions, first word that comes to mind, not too much, not to overthink it. What is your favorite word?
Um. Uh. Wow. Wow. Let's say wow.
The whole point is you got to stump a journalist. That's the
You already did it. Your first one out.
I got to wow. Now, what word do you hate?
Moist. That one's easy. I hate that word. Moist.
And what word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
Kernel. There's no
I
R
had
in
a
it.
hard, I had a hard time with that as well, especially as a non-English speaker. It's like colonel.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's illegal. It does not follow the rules.
Yeah, but that's a lot of English as well. So, what is your favorite word in another language, if any?
Zafra, which is in Cuba, the period right after they cut the cane and they got to get it to processing within 24, 48 hours, and the entire island mobilizes to hustle the cane across. And it's this kind of this hyped up thing that happens, this festival of work and solidarity. It's really amazing. Zafra.
And Ian, I didn't know that, and like many other things today, I'm learning a lot. Uh, how many languages do you speak?
2.
And I assume Spanish is the other one?
Yes.
Fair enough. And one word to describe yourself by.
Um, Intense.
Ian, this was a fun few words. That was the end of our rapid fire questions, and it's really designed to be fun, lighthearted, and
It's
not to
great.
overthink.
It
But
works well.
I got a wow out of you, so that was good. For somebody intense to get a wow.
Marvel at how stumped I was. That's why that was just.
No, and Ian, really appreciate your time today. I think it's been extremely informative. I've certainly learned a lot. I think the audience will, and I think I appreciate you sharing the ways in which the audience can also help, which is extremely important. I think being aware of everything the Outlaw Ocean Project is very it's from an audience perspective, it's a great way to get informed and to make some decisions in the future in light of that information that often we don't have or we don't know where to access it from, and it certainly comes with a lot of credibility. and most importantly, the making the time in to join us here pre-holidays. I certainly know it's a busy period, especially when you're preparing to go for a month in Antarctica or
Well,
by the
look,
water.
I appreciate it, and thank you. Let me pause again to say all the help you've given us on translation and interpretation has been game changing. So I really appreciate the long support you've provided.
And Ian, I think it's much like how we're encouraging the audience is very important that we step up because we believe in. I think need that support. Otherwise, they'll never advance without that level of commitment. So thank you again for the time today, Ian, and truly looking forward to some of the doing some future sessions coming up.
That's great. Well, thanks again for having me.